a little challenge for you.
Sure.
How are you at balancing on one leg?
Pretty good, I'd say. Hey, that's not fair, mate.
Funny you should say that. Today's guest believes a fair and balanced media sector is vital for a stable and healthy democracy. Sudhir Vadaketh is editor-in-chief at Jom, a new weekly digital magazine covering arts, culture, politics, business, technology, and more in Singapore.
Sudhir is a veteran of Asia's media industry. He's here today to share how the team at Jom are working to transform Singapore's media landscape.
Let's hear from him.
Welcome to the TransformAsians podcast. Sudhir, thank you for being our guest today.
Thanks, Charan.
Let me jump straight into our first question. I know you've been on a really long journey over the last 25 years in the media industry. What are some of the key changes you've seen in the industry?
I think the biggest one is the digital transformation. So I returned to Singapore from college in 2005, and I started work at the Economist Group shortly after that. And that was sort of at the tail end of people, both in terms of popular media still enjoying your hard copy magazine, but also in terms of research, your country reports, your risk analysis, people still putting out these long PDFs, right? Hard copy.
Everybody wants to print it out,
Printed PDFs, right? Not the soft copy and these thick things that we would hand out at meetings and things like that. And it was interesting to join the company at that point because I think the transformation digitally was just beginning, both in terms of the consumers becoming more used to reading on their computers, and then later when smartphones came around, reading on their phones, but also on the production side, writers getting used to writing for a digital audience, and that also required a bit of a shift. So I think that big digital transformation, which I think we're in many ways still living through, was the biggest thing to impact the media industry at large. And I can get into some of the details of what that meant if you...
Sure, I think it would be interesting to talk a little bit about that in terms of, what kind of information do you get in terms of consumption? How do you figure that out? Has that changed drastically from previously to how the digital, the kinds of power and benefits that you get from being a digital producer as opposed to a traditional publisher?
Yeah. So I think the good thing is that the digital form allows a lot more flexibility in some ways, right? During the production process of putting out content. Now, in terms of the threats to the industry, I think it's very important to note that what the digital transformation did, and this is related to the first point, the flexibility, the ease of getting online and putting out content. What that also meant is that you had this sort of slew of suddenly free online content available. Yes. Everything from daily news to even more serious sort of risk advisory, financial advisory type blogs that were started by different quote-unquote experts, some of whom actually were real experts, but there are also lots of charlatans out there across the entire spectrum. Yeah. And what happened then, and this is sort of mid-2000s onwards, it started off with personal blogs, and then it moved on to bigger sites that were also putting out a lot of, flimsy content. But what that meant for the audience is that it became harder and harder for the audience to distinguish, to discriminate between, what's good content, what's real content, what's fake content. And those are things that I think you saw the seeds of them in the mid-2000s, and we're still living with some of these issues around distinguishing between good and fake and just not so good content as well. Over the past few years, I think a trend has countered that, and which has been a sort of flight to quality, flight to truth, flight to safety, prompted partly, I think, by the Trump era and the Russian meddling in the U.S. election and all, troll farms in St. Petersburg and all that kind of thing. Right. Prompted, for a lot of readers, a bit of a flight to safety as well. So push away from some of those cheaper sites, which you see still happening today. But I think the idea of digital metrics is also really important to talk about.
Absolutely.
Right. So, in the pre-digital age, metrics were very different. quality was judged very differently, right? In terms of the media, what's a good article, what's not a good article, looking at subscription numbers, looking at distribution numbers for newspapers. But with the digital era, you suddenly had a lot more granular metrics, right? Eyeballs, engagement, likes, shares, all the rest of it. Now, at one level, you could argue that benefited the experience a little bit. It became a bit more social for the reader, the whole reading experience. I think for the producers of content, you also got much quicker feedback, right? You got feedback along a particular dimension, whether an article is going viral or not, or how many times it's being shared, or whatever it might be. So you got instant feedback in a way that was never possible in the print era. And maybe that helped in a certain way, but the whole digital metrics transition was also, and still is, very problematic.
Yes, indeed.
Right? Because it incentivizes a particular kind of content. And that created the conditions for sensationalism, for clickbaity type journalism. That was all created by the availability of these metrics, which people started to use a lot more. And this ties into the other big thing, which was the shift in business models with the digital transition, right? Because your print advertising model, died overnight almost, and producers of content had to shift to other sources of revenue. Digital advertising was one option, but again, with digital advertising, then it comes back to the issue of sensationalism and clickbait that we had, because then you had incentives
to drive people to
your site with clickbaity nonsense as opposed to proper journalism and proper news. Okay, I'll take a break there. And we can pick up on anything.
No problem.
They're all major kind of changes within that industry, quite clearly. And now, I think your point about the flight to truth is quite an interesting phrase, because clearly over the last year, you and some other founders have launched a new online editorial and news site, JOM. Could you talk to us a bit about your decision to launch JOM and the passion that you have behind it, and the sort of change that you're trying to see?
And the why you're doing this.
Sure. Before that, I guess the quick segue from the last point would be that we have deliberately chosen a reader-funded model, right, for JOM, which is a weekly magazine on Singapore. And the easiest way to sort of describe it, I guess, the easiest analog would be we're trying to create sort of a New Yorker or maybe an Atlantic type magazine for Southeast Asia. We're starting in Singapore, but the big global domination plan is actually
that's good to hear, man.
is actually for the whole region.
Fantastic.
So I think conditions have changed. Picking up what you said about truth, a flight to safety, flight to truth, and these sorts of things. Conditions have changed such that we're confident enough that we think there's a market that's willing to pay for good content in Singapore, which I wouldn't have said 5 or 7 or 10 years ago.
Okay.
So why did we start it? To Charan's question, I think there are a couple of reasons. One, Singapore's democracy is evolving and changing quickly. People are hungry for a diversity of opinions. And I think we realize that there's a hunger for proper independent media. For your viewers who aren't that familiar with Singapore's media industry, we had a very heavily government-controlled mainstream media dominated type industry in Singapore for many years. And the digital transition beginning in the mid-2000s started to change this with smaller outfits popping up. And I think now we're at the stage where, again, there's more and more hunger for that. And if you think about it at its very base level, Charan, the why, I think for a democracy to function well, the citizens need to be aware of what's going on.
Yes.
And when the media is completely controlled by the government, there are particular narratives that will never get out. I mean, in Singapore, the easy ones to talk about in terms of what we don't know enough about, the easy one is the Lee family, right? Anything to do with the Lee family, the level of discussion and discourse and information that's put out there will be extremely minimal, or it'll be very superficial, right? And I have lots of friends in the mainstream media, right? They're a lot of good people there, but they're all constrained in different ways in terms of what they are able to say or not. So, we're coming from this place, Singapore, where we've had one strong party in power. That strong party has been allied to its mainstream media channels that it controls in many different ways. And because of this, there are particular narratives that never get out. And so the why is, I think at a base level, if we're going to build a society that thrives on the exchange of ideas, which I think Singapore absolutely needs, then it's important to be able to talk about anything at all, not to have no-go zones,
OB markers,
OB markers, like we say in Singapore, out of bound markers.
Yes,
but yeah, so that's from a sort of passion, spiritual point of view. That's why we started JOM.
Right.
But there are all these other environmental factors, I think, that gave us enough confidence to do it now. I think we're also all great lovers of literary work
Right.
at JOM.
Yeah.
So I think there's a different dimension, which is about trying to raise the bar in terms of the literary product and just that in Singapore maybe being a bit lacking in our opinion.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
And how in your first year, how has the reaction to JOM been?
No, it's been great. It's been great. I think sort of at a personal level, I've had to come to terms with running a business and managing people and things like that.
Yeah.
But the response has been great, really gratifying. And I mean that not just in terms of our readers who really appreciate our content, but I think I mean that as well in terms of people in the broader Singapore sphere who may not be reading our content, but who really appreciate what we're trying to do, appreciate the role we're playing, as I just mentioned, in terms of plugging gaps in information and things like that. And surprisingly, I'd say this as well, because again, this is a sea change in Singapore. We also have gotten very good response from government agencies, government ministries,
Right.
response in terms of their willingness to deal with us.
Yeah.
That's surprising.
They are taking us seriously.
Yeah.
And the conversations and dialogues we have with them are also like just really transparent and fresh and frank, which is great. And I say it, it's important to note that 10 years ago in Singapore, if an indie media outfit tried to have a dialogue with the government, totally no answer, right? I mean, nobody would respond to you at all.
Right.
And I've been through that before.
Yeah.
But I think we're at a different stage again in terms of our evolution as a society. The government also realizes it has to engage
Right.
with independent media outfits, and this includes everybody from proper sort of magazines like us to content creators on Instagram that might have a big following. The government understands the need to actually have a good relationship with them because they themselves are influencers and influential in their own way. So I think the government internally as well has realized it has to change. And yeah, I'll just share one story. We've had such good relationships with them. We publish every Friday, and I think it was late last year we published, and we've got this sort of weekly digest that captures what's been going on in Singapore in the past week. And we wrote about this guy Jolovan Wham, who's a social worker and an activist. And we wrote about the incident where he held up a smiley face on a placard and actually got into trouble with the authorities. He was doing it to kind of poke fun at the fact in Singapore you can't protest, right?
Right.
So even the fact of holding up a smiley face is problematic in Singapore. So that was his kind of humorous way to poke fun at this law that we have.
Yeah.
And he got into trouble, and we reported on the final sentencing. So the incident happened a couple of years ago,
Right.
but the sentencing happened at the end of last year. We reported on the sentencing. We made a clear factual mistake in our reporting. So this is on a Friday. Monday morning, 10 a.m., the AGC, the Attorney General's Chambers, sends us an email. Dear Sudhir, we've spotted this, and here are the actual facts, and here's a link to the proper thing, and we suggest you make an amendment. So it was all very nice and sweet and polite, right? When my team saw this, they're like, "Oh shit, we're gonna get POFMA now, man." POFMA, for viewers who don't know, is Singapore's online falsehoods law.
Yeah.
Right.
So when somebody worries about being POFMA'd, it basically means you're worried that the government is going to issue you a correction notice that you have to append to the article or something like that. So Monday morning, everybody in my team, they're just so worried about getting a POFMA order. But I was like, no, it's calm. We're having a conversation, people make mistakes. They're acknowledging that, and we just changed it, acknowledged we made a mistake, and by 1 p.m. the same day, everything was sorted out.
Right.
So that again is, and I'm illustrating it because it's not clear to people on the outside sometimes that there's often a view that the government is still really cracking down hard on independent media. They're still treating us like shit. Yeah. It's not actually the case. Not to say that everything is like hunky dory. It's not. I mean, there's still challenges and problems. But I think back to your question about how the response to Jom has been, one encouraging thing for me has been these very harmonious relationships with the different actors in Singapore.
Right. Amazing.
I want to talk a little bit about the kind of technology trends and how that's impacted the media industry itself. Have you got any thoughts on that point, or what you've learned or observed?
Yeah, so I think the thing that we all grapple with a lot is attention scarcity, right? And by attention scarcity, it's the thing about, because of the mediums and the technology that have come into play in the past 15 to 20 years, and the way people consume content, the kind of content has become shorter and shorter. I think a bit of it is also heavier consumption of video content as well, as opposed to text content, which might have been heavier 20 years ago, in terms of whether you want to follow your favorite personality, or whether you want to find out what happened yesterday in Russia and Ukraine. That there's become a lot more consumption of that kind of information through video as opposed to text. And I think that has, as we all know, caused screwed around with our attention spans, right? Yes. Everybody's attention spans. Yes. And the smartphone is a big part of that, obviously, with like 15 apps running at the same time and different people messaging you. So from a journalist and a media company's point of view, it's about figuring out how to tailor the content for your key audience. And I think that's been a real challenge for everybody. It's an ongoing challenge. So what you've seen, to kind of come back to some of the earlier comments about the sort of thick reports and the thick magazines that we used to read back in the day. So I think what content creators or journalists have tried to do is create snapshots, or little summaries of pieces, which you might either append at the start of the video or at the start of the article, and basically figuring out ways. And it's not totally a bad thing, because I think in the old days we could be very long-winded in some ways. So it's not totally a bad thing to figure out how to be more concise in delivering your message. And that's why some of the best people on video, I think, are the ones who can deliver heavy messages in a very concise way.
Right.
But it is a challenge, because at the end of the day, what's competition for Jom today look like? Competition for Jom, if this was 30 years ago, would be very clear and defined, right? In terms of other weekly magazines, other newspapers about Singapore, whatever. Competition for Jom today is kind of hard to define, because is it, your short Netflix show that somebody's watching on their smartphone? Is it the role-playing game that they're playing on their phone on the MRT, on the way to work? In some shape or form, that's also our competition. It's competition for screen time.
Yes.
Yeah, you're really competing in that entertainment category as opposed to the publications category, which you used to historically.
Exactly.
So today it's all about how much of that attention of someone on a given day can you capture.
Yeah.
Excuse me. That could be video, that could be playing online games, that could be, chatting with friends, or for that matter, that could be reading a serious publication like yours.
Exactly.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, I was going to say, does that make the scale and the weight of the articles that you're writing, does that impact how you're sort of dealing with them? that attention scarcity, that,
So I'll tell you something that we do now, which kind of answers that. I mean, it does answer that.
Your Instagram cards, I love those guys.
Exactly.
I love them.
Exactly. So our writers work much more closely with our social media manager. I was going to say than we did in the old days, but that position wasn't even around in the old days. So we necessarily have to work closely. Our editorial team necessarily has to work closely with our social media manager. In fact, I shouldn't even frame it like that, because I consider our social media manager part of our editorial team.
I understand.
Right?
Yeah.
And what they do is that they every week look at what content is coming out from Jome, and they actually sort of summarize it for our Instagram channel, or they summarize it for our Facebook. We haven't really gone on TikTok yet, but Instagram is the main platform where they summarize it for the audience. And that process of taking a sometimes 3,000 word or 4,000 word essay on something like pretty deep and complex in Singapore, and figuring out to what extent you want to either leave it as a self-contained story. So this is the big challenge. Do we want to have it as a self-contained story on Instagram, or do we actually want to just leave it as a sort of a teaser? Click through to link in bio or whatever. Click through to read the full essay. And I think for different pieces, we make those decisions to do it differently.
Right.
And now the question is, how that thinking, and this is the difficulty I have sometimes with some of the younger writers I work with, whether that kind of conceptualizing of content, right, actually changes the way you think and changes the way you write your longer pieces. And I see that sometimes with some of the younger writers, that they spend so long trying to make like cute, snappy things on Instagram, which sometimes can be very emotive on a particular topic, especially let's say we're talking about the death penalty, right? It can be very emotive, and tons of shares, tons of likes. But if you spend your whole life just like writing for Instagram slides, right, you kind of lose something when it comes to then trying to reproduce 3,000 word analysis on the death penalty, right?
Yes.
And those two modes of thinking, I think good writers, we always say it's just a different literary muscle, right? So you train in one muscle, and then you train a different muscle. So I think good writers can easily move from one literary muscle to another. But the generation that's growing up now, and this gets back to short form content, it gets back to our discussion about virality and metrics. The generation that's coming up now, I sometimes worry that they're too sort of ensconced in this world of like super short, Instagram type messaging. And that could be for those who want to like really develop themselves as writers and as journalists and serious sort of thinkers in their particular field. That could be to their detriment.
Absolutely. Which kind of leads on for me a little bit to my other sort of question, which is I guess around people who when you started and to the point you're at now, who did you see as your audience? Who kind of are you seeing as your audience? And who do you really, is it actually young people that you want?
For Jome?
Yes. Yes.
I think so. When we started, we didn't really know, because there isn't really a product like us, I think.
Right.
I mean, there are some comparables. I think maybe Rice Media is possibly the closest to what we're trying to do, but it's still quite different in many ways. So I think it's hard to know who that audience was, but
you just had a view that there was an opportunity.
I knew there was an opportunity because if you look at I had also been testing the market for 10 years through my personal blog. Right. So I knew there was a market for my kind of writing and longer form writing, which didn't exist really in Singapore. But I didn't actually know what the sort of quote unquote target customer profile is, right? Because it's difficult. I would say we got into it just thinking, it's the same audience that might enjoy the New Yorker, or might then enjoy the Economist, or might then enjoy the FT, or some of these more literary magazines from overseas that you don't have a Singapore version of.
I understand. Yeah.
So that necessarily means people of a particular education level, usually means people of a particular income bracket as well, usually who are consuming those media products, as opposed to your daily news products. So your daily news products in Singapore would be everything from the Straits Times to Mothership. Right. So the profile of the reader for those kinds of products slightly different from the profile of the reader for our products, because not everybody actually wants to sit through a 3,000-word literary piece. It's too much for some people. So that was us getting into it, and then I think a couple of months ago we ran our first ever reader survey. So some of the one of the really surprising things for me, like in a really nice way, was when I looked at the income profile of our readers. It was just totally across the entire income spectrum. So our two biggest groups of readers are people who earn below $28,000 a year.
Right.
Okay. And people who earn over $200,000 a year. Those are Jome's two biggest groups.
Wow, fascinating.
And it's interesting because I guess, for the former group, the lower income group, they might probably just be following us for free, right? So following us on social media, or every now and then we put out free stuff on our website as well. So not everything is paywalled on our website. So that's my guess of that group. In terms of age, it's very clearly 25 to 55. Outside of that, there's a little bit, but not that much. I think our oldest reader, because they shared their age with us, is 78.
That's not Richard then?
At least.
Older than me.
Is that you?
Even older than me, believe it or not.
And what was the other interesting thing to me was we asked this question. My sort of the business advisors were always like whispering in my ear, asked me to ask this question: what other publications do you read? Right. So we have a sense for not just not necessarily competitors, but also like if we thinking of advertising and things like that. Where do we capture readers from? So Channel News Asia and the New York Times were by far the biggest.
Oh, really?
Which is surprising. I actually thought maybe like Rice Media, I thought maybe Straits Times, but actually it was CNA and the New York Times. And New York Times, of course, is a subscription product as well. Were by far the biggest. The New York, I think the Economist was the next biggest foreign publication, and the New Yorker was a bit below that.
Okay.
But so the typical comparables that people use on us, Rice Media, there's another company called New Narrative, Mothership maybe, which are the independent media outlets in Singapore. Those actually didn't feature that much.
Okay.
Which in a way was also encouraging for us, right? Because people are associating us in a different band and a different segment of publications.
Right. Very interesting. In our industry, there's always been a big debate between when you're thinking about your audiences, kind of like typical demographic profiling, which is around age and income and things like that, or profiling around interests, because you can see with interests that you can have just like you're talking about, a lower income group and an upper income group, but actually they have something that they're both very, very interested in.
Yeah.
And so marketing to them more around their interests than their age is always quite an interesting approach.
It's true. And I mean, in Singapore, there are many issues, everything from, social issues like gay rights to quote unquote bread and butter issues like housing, which have interest and appeal across the entire spectrum for different reasons, right? Take housing. I know there are people at the lower end, especially a lot of Gen Zs who are extremely worried now about housing affordability, right? And it's not even just about getting on the property ladder. Like a lot of people don't even think anymore about getting on the property ladder. It's just even about renting a room somewhere.
A roof over your head, really.
And just having a bit of space to call your own is getting very hard. But then, there's some criticism of government policy. There's also criticism of immigration and the impact immigration has had on our property market, especially post-COVID. But you also find the same conversation at the kind of much wealthier levels, right? Because people who 10 years ago might have thought that they could afford a landed property or they could afford a huge bungalow are having to scale down their ambitions. So, I meet very wealthy doctors and lawyers and all who also will criticize aspects of policy or criticize aspects of, lots of wealthy Chinese coming from Hong Kong and, buying up all our big bungalows and I'm priced out of the market. I obviously don't have any sympathy for those rich doctors. But, I'm simply saying that the housing issue actually affects, it affects, just because housing has been sold to us as this nest egg and the way to prepare for your retirement, and it's got such a, it's such a big part of the Singaporean psyche.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's just an example of an issue that would cut across.
Interesting. So besides, the kind of issues that you guys have been thinking about across society and in Singapore, I understand that you also have some rather interesting perspectives on how you guys operate the business and how you run the business in terms of the values and systems that you have in place. You want to tell us a little bit about that and how that's different from a traditional media outlet?
Yeah. So in terms, I'll make one comment about our approach to editorial, and then I'll make a couple of other comments around organizational behavior type things. So I think in terms of our approach to editorial, if you think about a very traditional, classical view of the media, it's almost this sense of a little bit of an ivory tower type of approach, right? Because the journalist necessarily has to be very distant from the subject in order to write quote unquote objectively or in order to write neutrally about the subject. I can't get too close to you, right? If I'm doing a story on AIDS in the 1980s, I shouldn't get too close to the survivors. I shouldn't, because that might affect my objectivity. This is the traditional idea in journalism, right? And so you're often at journalists keeping a lot of distance. Proximity was seen as a liability for journalists. Now with the new media world, 2000s onwards, and especially if you think about comedians as well, who, your Jon Stewarts of the world, who in many ways, Jon Stewart is one of the people who kind of reshaped the idea that comedy can actually deliver news, right? And there have been many others since him, John Oliver and Hassan Minhaj and all these guys, right? If you think about the idea that of news in comedy and other content creators and influencers also delivering this kind of information, they had a very different approach from the traditional journalists, right? And a lot of new media outfits have a very different approach. They don't see proximity as a liability anymore. In fact, they get very close to their subject sometimes. And it's a very different approach to journalism. And I think what Jom has tried to do editorially is somewhere in between these two, you know? So I think we do need to have a little bit of distance and we do value objectivity in our craft.
Yes.
But at the same time, we're not afraid to get close to our subjects, right? We think that responsible media today should actually think about all the stakeholders in the community when we actually both conceptualize the story, but also actually write the story. You know, what's the impact of the story going to be on the community you're in? Not the traditional mode, which is that I'm going to take a step back. I'm just going to put the story out into the world and not think too much about the impact on the different stakeholders.
Right.
So that editorially, we've got a slightly different approach. In terms of our organizational values, we're all fairly leftist within the organization, and I think we're sort of dabbling with different principles. One is around this concept called sociocracy, which is a new concept in terms of how you organize teams in an organization, very non-hierarchical. There's a lot of consensual decision-making in our organization as well. And these are things we're just starting to explore in terms of more sociocratic principles. The one thing I will say is that we do have something called wage compression in place.
Wage compression.
Yeah, and wage compression, to describe it very briefly, the classic example, basically, it's looking at the difference between your highest earner and your lowest earner. Okay. So the classic example is from the 90s, I think, when they did a study on motor companies, and they found that I think it was Ford or General Motors had 100 times differential, right? CEO to lowest paid worker, 100 times differential, and then they compared it to I think Toyota, and Toyota had a 30 times differential. So they use this to illustrate something about the nature of American capitalism versus Japanese sort of capitalism. And I think, so 100 times and 30 times. So for JOM, we realize we're operating in a country that is extremely unequal, right? In Singapore, income inequality is extreme, wealth inequality is extreme. If you look at our government and politics, it's probably about 100 times the differential, right? Because our prime minister earns over $2 million a year. And I'm pretty sure the person right at the bottom, and right at the bottom, you have to include the cleaners and the gardeners. Person right at the bottom is probably less than $20,000. So, 100 times. So at JOM, we have decided early on that we are going to have a cap on this. And I think the cap is going to be probably, we haven't decided yet, but it's going to be 4 or 5 times. So if you look at the salary from our top earner to our bottom earner, it's never going to be more than 4 or 5 times. And that's in keeping with our own internal sort of socialistic principles about equality.
Yes.
But we also hope at some point in time that we can influence others in society as well. But I will say that it's not easy. It's not easy doing that. It's not easy doing that in a place that is so hyper capitalized and where the market is so strong, right? It's not easy. Running an organization like that. I don't think I've faced the challenges yet, but I think once we start growing, and the big challenge is going to come if we start growing quickly. And for example, I want to hire a really top media business person, because we need a good business person on our team. That's probably going to be our next hire. And this person is earning market rate, at some other big media organization. Are they going to be willing to compromise for our values, right? In order to join JOM, and because we will have a inbuilt salary cap, right? Because we're never going to go more than 4 or 5 times. So these are challenges I foresee us having to deal with. But at the same time, if the person doesn't subscribe to our values, don't join us, right?
Yeah, exactly. Totally.
So,
it's a values-driven organization. Yeah, really interesting. It'll be super interesting to see how that kind of develops, because it's kind of another way of looking at the business model.
Yeah.
Very much against the norm.
Yeah. And I should say that we include all part-timers and contractors in that. I'm not just referring to full-timers. Right. So that 5 times limit includes contractors as well.
And so you're doing so many different things in terms of how you're approaching the business, how you have a very strong vision on what you want to bring to the community. I know it's a bit of a hackneyed sort of question, but what's success for you? What's the vision of success for the organization?
I think, aside from the obvious ones, which would be implied, I hope we become a great regional magazine, right? We all know that. But I think the values that we pass through the organization, the cohesion, I think another mark of success for us would be that we help to cultivate and develop the local journalistic talent in Singapore. And that's something we pay a lot of attention to, actually. And again, just to give an example, a lot of media companies come to Singapore. They hire 1 or 2 top people, both on the business side and on the editorial side. And then they outsource everything else, right? They'll find junior writers in Manila. They'll get their animation done in Malaysia or Vietnam or Indonesia. JOM, very deliberately, we try to give as many as possible. In fact, I think we only have one job so far that's a developer job. Somebody working on our website. He's based in Jakarta. But all our editorial content, right? And for me, the big one is animation, because I saw the rates for animators in Singapore versus Malaysia and Vietnam. It's much higher, which is fine. Singapore is an expensive place, and people should get paid to survive here. So I think we want to get to a point where everybody in the journalistic ecosystem, from writers to video animators and all these people, have enough jobs and have the ability to make a living wage in Singapore. So we very consciously do not want to outsource jobs to the rest of Southeast Asia
Until you become a regional magazine.
until we become a regional magazine.
Fair
yeah.
enough.
Even though that means higher costs for us, right?
Yes, sure.
Yes,
It
absolutely.
means higher costs for us.
Yeah. So then, I guess from a business perspective, people have got to be prepared to pay for the value of what you're delivering.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
And so
yeah.
it's there on our About Us mission page and all.
Yeah.
That we're going to be hiring local because we want to cultivate talent here. I mean, local, they don't have to have a Singapore passport.
I understand,
Right?
yeah.
But they're people based in Singapore because we want to, part of our mission is to cultivate talent here.
All right. Fantastic. Fantastic.
I wanted to just very quickly, as a final question, kind of ask you about your view on growing your audiences and how you do that, and maybe even for the sake of our listeners and viewers, tell us how they can connect with Jom.
Sure. I'll answer the second one first because it's very easy.
Please.
Just visit jom.media. Our company name is Jom, but our URL is jom.media, jom.media. And yeah, if you like what you see, please subscribe. And in terms of growing our audience, I think one of the really interesting things about the digital transition as well, if you think about the last 15 to 20 years, is in the way online platforms have allowed tribes and communities to find each other much more easily.
Yes.
Right? Which wasn't the case in the print era. You didn't really know who else enjoyed this particular article you might have read in that magazine, and you didn't find a way to connect with them emotionally about an issue you might be very passionate about. And that's been one of the great things about social media, actually. And so in line with that, I think that also allows Jom to have a community where we can have conversations about things that people are passionate about, whether it's through our social media channels, or sometimes we have reader events as well, where we get people into a room. And I think, again, because we're a values-driven organization, I think because we started this with a very specific mission of doing something in Singapore in terms of Singapore society and democracy and things like that, people who share those passions as well are drawn to us.
Yeah.
So there's an ability for us to, sort of build our audience, not simply some, people who might be interested in journalism, but
Yeah.
build our audience in people who are basically on the same page as us about what we're trying to achieve. And technology allows us to do that in a way that, 20 years ago would have been impossible.
A really nice phrase, isn't it? On the same page.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
It's been a brilliant chat. Honestly, really, really interested in your thoughts and what you're doing with Jom and the change that you're driving. It's interesting for me. One of my takeouts from all of the things that you've talked about was just that point that you made about, as a journalist, not sitting back in your ivory tower, but getting out into your communities and understanding your stakeholders and understanding the impact that your work has with them. It's a very useful point for us in the marketing industry, where so often people sit in the marketing department or the agency and never get out in the market and meet with the consumers and the humans that are actually behind their business. So that's a fantastic takeout for me. Thank you.
Thanks.
For me, I think what was interesting is really what you observed about the growth of independent media in Singapore, right? I mean, I've personally been following this scene my entire life in Singapore, and I can definitely see that happening, even though there's fear of being POFMAT, as you say, or, a few lawsuits here and there that happen regularly. But it's very heartening to hear that the agencies and the government is actually engaging with you guys, because I think they're maturing, we're maturing as a society, and I think that's really what I think you guys are contributing to in a really positive way. So thank you for that as well.
Thanks, Charan. Appreciate it.
My pleasure, man. Thank you, Sudhir. And thank you for joining us this week in our interview with Sudhir from Jom Media. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, subscribe to Jom Media as well. And we'll see you in our next podcast. Thank you very much and good day.